So welcome. This is our panel on the countdown to Form CRS. So our idea here today is, here's the agenda. So I think what we'd like to do is provide a fairly brief overview of Form CRS. I'm assuming by this time you're all familiar with the form, the content requirements, and what we'd really like to do is really focus on some of the implementation challenges that we're hearing, that I'm hearing from members and that the folks up here are sort of working through as well, and then obviously, as you're working through. So, we will go through some of the specific disclosure items. We'll talk about the filing, the delivery, the updating, record-keeping requirements, but really the focus will be on the implementation challenges. So before I get started, why don't I ask each of the panelists, I'm not going to go through their bios are in the materials, but what I would like to do is ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, but to talk about what they're working on with respect to Form CRS, so you can get a sense of where we're all coming with. I'll get started. My name is Sanjay Lamba. I'm with the Investment Advisor Association, and my work on Form CRS initially was helping the IA put together its comment letter to the SEC on Form CRS. And since then, I've been working with members through our IA Form CRS implementation group to work through some of the implementation challenges. So I'm just curious, how many folks here are in the CRS implementation group? If you could just kind of raise your hand. So quite a few folks. Good to see you all in person. So that's sort of been what I've been working on. So Danielle, do you want to?
Sure. So my name is Danielle Nicholson Smith. I'm a principal and attorney for T. Rowe Price, and I have been leading our Form CRS legal task force since the summer of last year, and so I've been heavily involved in all things CRS for longer than I would like, probably, and also working closely with our retail advisory business on implementation.
Do I need to push it on?
No, it should be green.
Oh, okay, great. I'm Jen Klass. I co-head the Financial Regulation and Enforcement practice at Baker McKenzie. So I'm looking at this really from the private practice side, and we've been counseling a wide range of clients about how to essentially put together their Form CRS, and then how to address many of the implementation questions that come up when you really try to put this into practice and operationalize it.
And even before I give my name, I'll give my disclosure. The views I express today are my own and do not reflect those of the Commission, the staff, or the Commissioners. So my name is Benjamin Tecmire. I'm with the SEC. I'm in the Division of Investment Management in the Rulemaking Office for Investment Advisors. I was part of the staff that worked on the Form CRS release. I am continued to be tethered to CRS in the drafting of FAQs and taking in, obviously, your all's continuing feedback, which I'll just say to begin with is much appreciated and continually welcome.
Great. So I do want to remind everyone to please ask questions. I think you can raise your hand, speak up. I think we have runners walking around with cards, but we'd really like to make this interactive. I mean, we all have I have issues that I've been hearing about from members. Everyone's sort of working through issues, but I'm sure there's things that you guys are wondering. Basic questions, no question is too basic, so please feel free to ask. And I think, Ben, you'd also agree it'd be kind of nice for you to hear some of the issues that folks are sort of struggling with. And I promise you can't read your name badges, it's too far away. So it'd be great for, I think, the SEC to also hear some of these issues. So with that said, so before I get started, I would like to sort of do a quick show of hands. So how many folks here are dual registrants? Okay. How many folks have affiliated broker-dealers? Okay. So some of the issues that we'll talk about, we'll touch on some of the unique issues that you all face as well. Okay. So some of the stated objectives of Form CRS was to, the SEC adopted this new disclosure document to, according to them, reduce investor confusion and facilitate comparison. The idea is that there was a sense that investors did not have an idea as to which type of financial professional they're dealing with, broker-dealer, investment advisor, and so the part of the objectives here was to sort of facilitate comparison. It is intended for retail investors, and we'll talk through the definition of retail and what that means and why it's not as clear as it sounds. It is required for registered investment advisors and broker-dealers and dual registrants, and there's unique requirements for each. We'll obviously focus on RIA issues and dual registrants to some extent. It is a new disclosure document. In addition to your RIA brochure, it's new Part 3 to your Form ADV. And time is running out. You have to prepare and file by June 30th, and you will have to deliver it to your new clients as well as existing clients. So that's a quick overview. And before I turn it over to you, Ben, to sort of give a quick summary of sort of what the requirements are, I'm going to ask you a question that I get asked every time I talk about Form CRS, almost on all of my calls with members on CRS, which is, why are you forcing or why are you requiring firms to deliver a new disclosure document to their clients?
Well, Sanjay, you stole a little bit of my thunder, and you've given the answer already, and it's really to reduce retail investor confusion who are in the marketplace for I and BD services, and it's to assist these retail investors with the process of making that decision to engage or to continue to engage investment advisory and broker-dealer firms. So.
Great. Okay, so now we know. So I think I will say the ship has sailed. So yes, you will have to do it. It is a new requirement. So Ben, you want to just maybe give us a quick overview of what Form CRS is, just to sort of set the table for our discussion and what their disclosure requirements are?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, with those goals in mind, those objectives in mind, how did we seek to really achieve those objectives? And really, the first one is the brevity or the readability of the relationship summary. It is plain English, it is brief, 2-page limit for individual firms, 4-page for dual registrants or affiliated firms. And in light of that page limit, it's really supposed to be, it's high level by necessity. And it's, again, designed to facilitate retail investor access to and provide context for the more layered or detailed disclosures such as Form ADV Part 2. And again, we focus on really the comparability aspect as well, so that each firm's relationship summary will address the same topics in the same order in a question and answer format. These topics, which we'll get into more detail, discuss information about services, relationship, fees, conflicts of interest, the standard of conduct, disciplinary history. Firms that obviously, dual registrants and affiliated firms that offer both brokerage and advisory services, they're going to be required to describe those services in a manner that clearly distinguishes and facilitates comparison between the two. Again, there's going to be more information available to retail investors on the form. There's going to be the requirement to link to the investor.gov, which will have more general educational information available about broker-dealers, investment advisors, the individual financial professionals, and other topics about investing. This was the result of I'll say unprecedented amount of outreach and investor input and testing, and when we were developing the CRS form. And this feedback really informed our final rule. And again, I'll just reiterate the appreciation that we have for everybody who contributed to that process. We considered information provided by commenters that submitted their own studies. We had a feedback form. I think we had 90 feedback forms filled out and sent back to us. We engaged in roundtable discussions. I think we did about 7 of them. I think there were over 200 participants that provided a response. And like I said, in response to all that feedback, it really informed those final changes we made, such as permitting more flexibility than the proposal for firms to accurately describe their business types without limiting them with a large amount of prescribed wording. And we revised requirements about a firm's standard of conduct and conflicts of interest to make that information clearer to the retail investors. And we added disclosures about individual financial professionals' compensation, included a separate discussion about disciplinary history. So all that feedback, resulted in that final form.
So I think one of the challenges, Danielle's questions for you is there is a 2-page limit for standalone investment advisors. If you're a dual registrant, you can do 4, but 2 pages is not a lot, and oftentimes I think I'm hearing that it's really difficult to sort of do that. So can you talk a little bit about sort of what the challenges that you've sort of faced with that?
Sure. So 2 pages is not a lot, and as we continue to work on it, it's getting smaller and smaller as we discover more information that we would like to include, but don't have the room for. So one of the things that we've been trying to keep in mind is that, to Ben's point, this is really intended to be a summary of the principal, services, relationships, costs, conflicts of interest, and disciplinary or legal history. It's not intended to be the one and only document that your retail investors are going to read. It's intended for comparability. So if you keep that in mind as you're drafting it, and you understand that the SEC is encouraging layering of disclosure, which means that you can and should provide hyperlinks or URLs to specific sections of your Part 2A brochure that provide more details on conflicts of interest, for example. It really helps you to cut down on a lot of the chatter that you might otherwise include in it. You know, as lawyers, we tend to want to over-disclose, and this, you cannot over-disclose in this two-page format, especially if you're going to enhance readability and provide white space and really make this a resource for retail investors.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, we have a sign up here for speakers that says relax and breathe. That's sort of my response to how do I fit everything into 2 pages. I think you really do, as Danielle said, have to buy into the layered disclosure concept and recognize that this goes against our nature and against our grain in terms of wanting to make sure that our disclosure is as comprehensive as possible. And frankly, the SEC has been very focused on whether the disclosure is adequate and comprehensive. But this is an exception, right? Because this is really intended to be a high-level piece, and I think we have to take the SEC at its word in terms of that's what it's designed to achieve.
Yeah, and there is, you know, and just to sort of emphasize that, the commission, there is an instruction that sort of talks about the disclosure has to be full and fair, but they will sort of consider the context that it's being made, right? And so I think the idea there is that it's a summary, and so you sort of look at it with that lens. So Jen, we talked about that this document is intended for retail investors. Can you maybe walk us through sort of the definition and sort of how you interpret that?
Yeah, sure. So the SEC created this new definition of a retail investor under Form CRS, which is a natural person or the legal representative of a natural person who's seeking or receiving services solely for or primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. And so in the first instance, it's focused on natural persons. We can get into the discussion of a legal representative, but a legal representative is not a regulated financial services or other financial institution. It is really intended to be, you know, more along the lines of someone who's acting as a trustee or has a power of attorney over the account, something that's more tied to the personal piece of it as opposed to a professional investor. The definition reaches people who are prospective clients as well as existing clients. So the seeks to or receives, the seeks to concept goes to someone who's a prospective investor. And I think unlike the definition of a retail customer under Reg BI, retail investor is really designed to be broader and it's not tied to any sort of recommendation or the provision of advice. Rather, it's intended to be delivered to people who are thinking about obtaining advisory or brokerage services at the point at which they're actually thinking about that. So that's an earlier point in the relationship than when you're actually providing investment advice or giving a recommendation.
So, Ben, the SEC recently put out an FAQ talking about who would be considered a legal representative. Could you perhaps maybe tell the audience about that FAQ?
Well, sure. So we'd received obviously a number of questions regarding this, about the term legal representative as it is used in the definition of retail investor. We wanted to provide the public, obviously, with information about this. A lot of this draws from what we said in the release. We think between what we said in the FAQ And in the release, it should provide firms with the information to do that analysis about who fits in to the retail investor with regards to the legal rep.
So, Jen, I think now that we sort of have the definition, I've seen sort of a lot of issues come up as to this notion of legal representative. And one question I've gotten asked about are family offices. Can you maybe talk about how that fits?
Yeah, I mean, family offices aren't expressly referenced in the adopting release or in the FAQs. And so I think you really have to think about the nature of the family office and the role that they're performing. To the extent that a family office involves investment professionals who are retained by natural persons to exercise independent investment judgment, I think that they fall out of the concept of a legal representative of a natural person. They're more in the nature of a professional investor. And so I don't think that they themselves would be considered retail investors.
And what about investors in hedge funds or private equity funds? Are they entitled to receive a Form CRS if they fit?
Well, the investors, the advice is provided to the fund itself, not to the underlying investors. And the SEC has said through the FAQs that the fund itself wouldn't be considered a retail investor.
Great. So are there any other sort of interpretive or issues that you sort of encountered? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things that come up. One is, as you heard in the definition, there is no focus on net worth or financial sophistication. The SEC didn't draw a distinction between retail investors and non-retail investors based upon net worth, and that's consistent with some of the statements we heard earlier in the day that that wealth should not necessarily be a proxy for financial sophistication. So you should take that into consideration. There's been a lot of questions around retail plan participants in retirement plans. And to the extent that investment advisors are providing advice to the plan fiduciary itself, for example, the lineup of the funds that would be available in the plan, right, that plan fiduciary would not be considered a retail investor. But the underlying plan participants would, to the extent that the advisor is providing advice and helping them determine how they should allocate their assets. Those are some of the things that I think we've seen most of the questions around.
Great. So yes, Warren Buffett will be getting Form CRS.
That's right. That's right.
So it seems to me, Danielle, that sort of one of the threshold questions that folks are going to have to think about for either new clients or existing clients is, do they fall within the definition? Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you guys are sort of handling that?
Yeah, certainly. So we have 2 U.S.-based investment advisors. The first is dedicated to retail investors. So that's an easy answer for us. All of them would fall under the retail investor category. It's significantly more difficult, obviously, for our institutional advisor. So we've had to vet all of the existing clients to determine, first of all, whether they're a natural person, 2-legged person, and then secondly, if they are, then are they investing for a household or personal use? So that took quite a bit of time. We put everybody through the colander, so to speak, and then located the retail investors within our institutional business. So, and to Jennifer's point, since there's no asset size cutoff, these are people who may have upwards of $50 million in assets, but they are, again, still considered retail investors, so we will be providing Form CRS to them.
And Jen, I know, I feel like you mentioned that you were on call or you had a late night emergency call. You're like an on-call lawyer here. So are there any issues surrounding this that you've been?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think the biggest practical issue is how you differentiate your clients between retail investors and non-retail investors, because that is not really, as I said, this is a new definition, so firms don't have any sort of indication necessarily in their systems that they can just sort on to identify these clients. And so that has been one of the implementation issues associated with it. Some of the late night calls have related more to affiliated advisors, either people who are dual registrants or our affiliates. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the delivery context, but in that case, you have to deliver the Form CRS or the Relationship Summary to both your investment advisor clients and also your broker-dealer clients. And so there are a lot of issues in terms of how that happens, ensuring that the clients get both, if you have two separate Form CRSs, get both relationship summaries at the same time. And that just becomes sort of an operational issue that firms need to deal with.
Great. So we've got a lot of questions here. So let me. So Jen, maybe this would be a good one for you. So in the use of model delivery to SMA, can you maybe talk about sort of how this would play out in sort of that area? So I know it's a question that's come up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something where the SEC provided a helpful FAQ on, to the extent that you're providing a model portfolio to an investment advisor and you're just the model provider and don't have an end relationship and are not providing advice through to the end investor, there's no delivery obligation through to the end investor. And so I think that helped clarify a lot of concern and confusion in the industry. I think the flip side is if you are providing discretionary investment advice and not through a model program, then you are effectively acting as an investment advisor to the retail investors, and the Form CRS would have to be delivered through along with your Part 2A.
And so how would that play out in the sub-advisory relationship as well?
Yeah, I mean, the sub-advisory context is, I think, a little bit uncertain. And so you have to evaluate whether or not the sub-advisor is actually providing advice to the end investor. To the extent that the sub-advisor is, then there would be a parallel delivery requirement.
Great. So I've got some other questions here. I'm going to try to weave them in as we sort of go out, but why don't we on to the next topic? So the relationships and services. Danielle, do you want to maybe talk to us some of the issues that you're dealing with here?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, this is really about providing a brief summary of the principal services that you provide to your clients and listing out any specifics such as financial planning, wrap fee programs, et cetera. So again, this is probably one of the meatier answers to the Form CRS questions, because this is where you're really explaining to clients what you offer to them. So we have both discretionary and non-discretionary programs, and I actually think the SEC did a really good job of, in their template, their sample template for the Form CRS, providing language, plain English language that you can use to describe to a retail level investor what's the difference between a discretionary program and a non-discretionary program in a way that they can easily understand. So we referred back to that quite a bit, again, for the plain language and providing a fulsome answer to the question.
Sorry, Abella. So Jen, one question I have for you has to do with the conflicts disclosures. And so, are we on the right slide? Yeah. So it lists in the instructions, there's 3 that if you have those, you have to disclose. What if you don't have any of those stated conflicts? How do you go about picking which conflicts to disclose? You have to only provide an example, right? 1 or 2, but what's the process that firms should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think first you have to, again, take the SEC at their word that they're looking for, material conflicts, and not all of your conflicts, but, primary conflicts. So if you don't have proprietary products or principal trading or the other conflicts that the SEC actually references in the form, then I think you have to go to the next sort of most material conflict. And I would say that it's very likely going to be around financial incentives associated with the provision of advice. And so that's where really we've been guiding firms to think about what their main conflicts are, but really to prioritize based upon where their financial incentives.
Okay, wow, I've got a lot of questions here, so let me see if I can weave them through here. If we can go back to the definition of retail. So the question has come up in the wrap program context. You are a manager to a RAP program, there's a separate sponsor. What's your delivery obligation there?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the RAP programs have converted to model scenarios where you're providing a model to the RAP sponsor. In that case, as we've talked about, you don't have to deliver through. But if it's not a model program, then I think that the Form CRS follows your 2A delivery obligation, and it would be, it's typically contractually the sponsor who will deliver the 2A, and the Form 3 or CRS would have to be added to that bundle of documentation that's delivered before the client or at the time that the client signs the advisory agreement.
Yeah, and I would emphasize that, if you are delivering a brochure, it's probably safe to assume that you should also be delivering a CRS.
I think that's right.
So one question I got here is, to mitigate operational burdens, is there any problem with just delivering Form CRS to all clients? Ben, I can have you answer, but I think it was in the release, the commission noted that you do sort of have that option. If you just want to give it to all your clients, that is something that you're permitted to do. Is that?
They certainly don't stop you from, providing other communications with your clients, so,
Over-compliance is never frowned upon. I do think if you're going to take that approach, you have to be thoughtful, obviously, because you don't want to create confusion. So if you end up providing a Form CRS to clients for whom retail advice really isn't, part of the services that they're seeking, it may become confusing. But that's certainly a way to simplify the operational burden.
Okay, so I really do have a ton of questions up here, and I won't, I'll try to work them in, but please come up afterwards, and we'll try to help out. But I do want to make sure we cover sort of all the topics. Was there anything else on sort of fees, costs, and conflicts of interest, standard of conduct disclosure that you guys wanted to highlight as being an issue?
No, I mean, I think firms, as you're drafting Form CRS, just have to be thoughtful about where the SEC is mandating specific language that has to be used, and the standard of conduct is one of those places where they've essentially drafted your disclosure to describe the standard of conduct. There are places where you can have more flexibility, but you just have to be thoughtful about that as you're putting together the Form CRS.
Compensation. I think, Danielle, were you taking this one?
Yeah, I can do this. So this is, again, an area where I think less is more. If you can summarize how your financial professionals are compensated in a way that includes both cash and non-cash compensation, but again, doesn't just regurgitate what you have in your Part 2A, I think that's more in line with the idea of providing a brief summary. So if your reps or some of your reps are getting compensated based on incentive programs for sales of, for retention of assets, for example, obviously you want to include that type of information. I think we probably went on the side of over-disclosure in this area because we felt like it was important for clients to understand also how our portfolio managers are compensated, and that it's, their compensation is tied to a long time horizon, et cetera. So that's how we chose to address it.
I would just mention, you highlight the importance, and this is, as I said in my introduction, in the overview, this is one of these areas that we received a fair amount of feedback and commenters talking about financial professional compensation, and that it was important to them. And they illustrated this in not only the responses, but in some of the mock-ups actually that they provided by including it. And as we stated in the release, we think this will help, retail investors understand the conflicts and how they might impact the financial professional's motivation. So we think it's an important distinction to make, and it's different than a firm-level compensation disclosure. So it was an add-on for a lot of the feedback we received. So.
I think, though, it's not substantially different from the requirement currently that's in Part 2B for individual reps.
Right.
And so I think it's important when you're drafting this, we're already providing this information at the individual rep level, so make sure as you aggregate that and sort of provide a higher level consolidated view of how you compensate all of your employees, that you're consistent with what's in your 2Bs as well. just so that there aren't any sort of problems down the road with respect to inaccurate or inconsistent disclosure.
And fees just generally too, as in the other parts of CRS, investors said the firm level fees again was important, but taking your point that once you start putting in fee information into the CRS, you start to increase the length. So we were trying to balance really the brevity of the CRS, the goal of the brevity of the CRS, with the importance of that fee information. So this, as you said, remaining at a high level. And understanding that statements in the CRS, like we said in the release, are made in the light of the viewed in the light of the circumstances in which they're made, is important to remember while drafting.
One point I just wanted to add on, because made me realize something about how our business may differ from those in the audience, but we only provide Part 2Bs for a small subset of our total financial professional base, because only a small subset actually formulate advice for investors. So one of the reasons why we had to be a little bit more, we felt like we had to be a little bit more fulsome in this answer is because we couldn't point necessarily to a 2B for investors to get more information.
I will say, one of the lessons we've learned looking at the SEC enforcement trends and the priorities over the last several years is this continuing focus on compensation and conflicts associated with compensation. And so while it should still be high level and brief, I think you have to spend, be very careful in terms of how this language is crafted. Make sure it's consistent with your other disclosures as we have talked about. Don't use conditional language like may. Take all of those other lessons we've learned over the last several years to heart when you're putting this language together.
Great. So the next topic I'd like to talk about is the question on the disciplinary history. And we were talking a little bit about this one, and there are a lot of issues with this one. And Jen, maybe you want to share some of what we were.
Yeah, so I think I understand, and I'm sure Ben can tell us a little bit more about sort of the rationale behind putting the disciplinary information into the Form CRS. But the way that it has been done with sort of a yes-no question, I think really creates a lot of trepidation for firms, because the answer will generally be yes if you have a firm of any size, because even if the firm itself hasn't had any disciplinary history that needs to be reported, very frequently there will be reps who do. And I think firms are very uncomfortable from a client experience and relationship perspective of saying disciplinary information, yes, period, without any further explanation. And so we've been trying to help clients craft a little bit more explanation that goes along with it. You still have to answer yes or no, that's what the form requires. But I think you can elaborate to some degree and say, the disciplinary information relates to certain of our, registered representatives. And there will always be a cross-reference back to the IARD system where the client can look up that information. But I think that's been a lot of the heartache.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This is one of the questions that we've struggled with the most, because neither of our advisors have any reportable legal or disciplinary history. But of course, there are financial professionals from both advisors who do. So we will have to answer yes. But there is an internal discussion now in the firm, because it seems almost to be, not intentionally, but to be sort of punishing firms who don't have a disciplinary history at the firm level, but do have financial professionals who may have a reportable event that was, for example, a personal bankruptcy, or something that has nothing to do with their role as an investment advisor representative. So we've struggled with the yes or no answer as well, and whether we were torn between, do we provide more color and give examples of the types of events, disciplinary or legal events, that our financial professionals have, to give some amount of color to our retail investors, so they're not concerned about, is the person who's helping me with my financial plan, have they been convicted of embezzlement, for example?
Right.
So we haven't yet decided whether we're going to provide that additional color, but it is certainly something that firms will have to address when it comes to the conversation starters.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, the events that trigger a yes response are based on current disclosures that are available to the public on existing systems. And using the existing triggers we think will result in a consistent disclosure and will be more efficient for firms to determine the appropriate response. Understanding, as we said in the release, that larger and older firms are more likely to respond affirmatively to the question than perhaps smaller or newer firms do. But we had to weigh that against the balance of the potential benefit to retail investors, seeing at a glance whether a firm or its financial professionals have disciplinary events. In the feedback we received, there was a significant amount of support from retail investors to have this information, even though it's already publicly available. To have it in the retail, the relationship summary was identified as very important to them. And again, there'll be a conversation starter on it that will potentially begin a conversation about what that answer means. And they'll be given the information to dig deeper to the extent that they want more information of what that answer means or what they're told maybe as a result of that conversation starter. So,
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, that assumes that the client asked the question and is engaged in the conversation, as opposed to simply seeing yes and moving on. And the form, as we talked about, doesn't differentiate between firm level and rep level disciplinary events, and I would argue that those things are materially different. And so I don't necessarily think it makes sense to sort of provide examples or to try to summarize your disciplinary events. Obviously, that's not going to be possible given the space limitations. But I think it might be helpful to have some broad language that just talks about what disciplinary events are and what that means in the financial services industry, and whether or not your events relate to reps or to the firm level.
So are you talking about like an additional disclosure document or putting
No,
it into
I mean,
the CRS or?
I'm talking about like an additional sentence or two in your Form CRS in the disciplinary history section.
So we've been sort of talking about these conversation starters, and so I've sort of flipped the slide here, and this one's I think a big one that I want to spend some time on. So Danielle, so what are these conversation starters about, and so what are some of the issues? I know we alluded to some of them, but what are some of the issues that you've been struggling with there?
Yeah, so the conversation starters actually are breaking new ground, because what they're designed to do is give retail investors the tools and specifically worded questions so they can ask their representative about some of the most meaningful information that a retail investor wants to understand. So fees, what fees are I going to pay? What are the qualifications of the person I'm speaking to who's providing the advice to me? What conflicts of interest do you have? Again, the disciplinary history question. So what's interesting to me about the form and how it's structured is, we're required to include the questions, but not necessarily the answers. And part of that, of course, is because 3 of the 7 or so questions are really specific to the actual person that the retail investor is interacting with at that moment. So it's asking about, specifically, what are my qualifications? What's my educational background? What's my background in the industry? Do I have a legal or disciplinary history? So it's intended for a conversation between the representative and the retail investor. So I think that's fairly unique disclosure in terms of the industry. What's interesting for us is, training our representatives on how to answer these questions. We are not going to be required to provide the answers online, because we do provide access to representatives. Our advisory services aren't solely provided online, but we are planning to, because we're trying to enhance the comparability between our firm and other firms, and we think that's a good way to do it. If you post these conversation starters, these answers, it's easy for people to go online, people who prefer really to get their information online versus asking an individual rep. But on the flip side of that, we're also engaging in a lot of training with our financial professionals to make sure that they can answer the questions that are directed to them specifically in ways that provide transparency to the client, but yet don't expose the representative to what could be an awkward conversation about legal history that doesn't have anything to do with the financial services industry, like, you know, a personal bankruptcy. So we've involved our human resources department, and we're making sure that we're really thinking carefully about how those conversations could go and what types of information the client may want once they hear, yes, I have a legal or disciplinary history, that goes beyond what's reportable on broker check, for example. So you have to be thinking through not just the questions and, you know, what your firm level answer is going to be, but how are your reps on the phone, on the front line, going to be able to answer these questions in a way that satisfies both the requirement, but yet, you know, is protecting the rep.
Yeah, and I think that's the most challenging implementation issue with respect to the conversation starters, is how do we actually answer those questions? And making sure that the reps, as you said, understand what they should be saying, and how they can engage in that conversation in a way that's meaningful and transparent to the client. One thing I just want to elaborate on in terms of what you said, you know, if a firm offers digital advisory solutions and there are no reps involved in the provision of advice, then you're not required to have people on hand to answer these questions. You can just provide written answers and post them on the website. But if you have a hybrid model, or if you have a more traditional model where advice is provided through human beings, then you do get into this whole sort of training issue and ensuring that they know how best to respond.
So Danielle, are you sort of, so obviously training is a big component of it, but are you also sort of preparing scripts for your reps to sort of talk by, or just outlines, or I mean, just so how you?
Yeah, so I think we're going to have a combination of the two. So for certain of the questions, for example, given my financial situation, should I choose an investment advisory service? That's something that we'll probably script out for the rep based on several different prototypes of clients' financial situations. And then for others, we're going to really need to be giving talking points and coaching individual reps who have legal or disciplinary history, because obviously they're going to be answering that question differently from reps who don't. So it's really going to be a combination approach.
Jen, one question that sort of, I don't know, scares me a little bit is this, how might your conflicts of interest affect me, and how will you address them? That seems like a pretty open-ended question, and it's, any issues or concerns that you see about potential lines there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, you know, given the focus on conflicts from an enforcement perspective, I think this is an area where there has to be sort of heightened training and talking points for reps so that they understand how best to respond to those questions and how best to describe conflicts that exist. You know, I think this goes hand in hand with firms taking a broader look at what their conflicts are and evaluating whether they may need to be moving away from some of the conflicts, particularly at the sales representative level. So, you know, differential compensation or sales contests and practices, those things are already sort of on the table as a result of the Reg BI rulemaking, at least with respect to dual registrants. So you may need to take a step back and think about whether there are conflicts that you actually want to eliminate or mitigate to make it easier for your representatives to respond to these questions. Again, you know, to the extent that that is feasible.
So Ben, so in the instructions and in the release, there's some discussion that it talks about how you can modify or omit or sort of change some of these requirements, including the conversation starters. Can you talk a little bit about sort of, how you sort of think that could play out? I mean, I'll give you an example. So one question has to do with this $10,000 example. If I give you $10,000, how will you invest? And so one question I've been getting from members is, well, our account minimums are a lot higher than that, and so it just seems kind of confusing to talk about 10,000. Can we put a higher number in there and sort of give an example? That's an easy, maybe that's like a minor one, but so can you talk about sort of what you can see or what you've heard of firms being able to change?
Sure. So, I mean, maybe it might be helpful just to talk a little bit of how we got to this conversation starter format. So as you all, I'm sure, remember from reading the proposal, there was a 14-question list at the very end. I think it was called the key questions section, where a lot of these or similar questions were asked. When we got part of our mountain of feedback was that, while they found the questions potentially useful, having them in their own separate section away from the context of where the information is going to be provided in the form was an area of improvement that we received. So that's kind of how these kind of came from that 14-point list to being closer to the information being described, and there's a much better comprehension and understanding of the question alongside the information that's going to be provided by the firms. So there are two instructions, and instructions 2B and C, that talk about that are relevant for your question, in that where B says that firms can omit, modify required disclosures or conversation starters that are inapplicable to their business, or specific wording required by the final instructions that is inaccurate, coupled with 2 saying that responses have to be for factual, balanced descriptions to help investors evaluate your services. You're not supposed to be giving exaggerated or unsubstantiated claims, so that's something to think about when you're considering a potential modification. And that anything you put in the form shouldn't be misleading given the circumstances that it's made. So that might be helpful for firms that are evaluating each of the prescribed wordings in the conversation starter.
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas where I've seen this play out a lot is investment advisors who offer their services through financial intermediaries. So they're providing discretionary advice to the end investor, but they're not actually determining the suitability or identifying the right strategy or product, or really interfacing with the client prior to managing the assets. And so in that context, some of these conversation starters do get omitted or modified because they're simply not going to be applicable to that particular business model. So I do think you have to, taking into consideration everything Ben just said about ensuring that any changes are not misleading and accurate, I do think you have to take into consideration your business model and think about whether there are adjustments that need to be made, just based on the services that you're offering.
And just to reiterate from earlier, again, one of the key values is the comparability, and core to that comparability among firms is the same order and same topics. So again, perhaps a consideration.
So any last thoughts on conversation starters before we okay?
I would just say the first 2 that go to, should I choose investment advisory services or not, and how will you choose investments to recommend to me, obviously goes to a broader question about suitability, what's on the platform, and how a representative is taking that into consideration. Again, dual-hatted representatives have an obligation to consider brokerage and advisory services, and so I guess the point here is just that the responses to the conversation starters need to sort of fit up with the framework that you've put in place around recommendations and suitability of brokerage versus advice, or advisory product A versus product B.
Yeah, I think this is one area, even if you haven't started actually drafting Form CRS, I would highly recommend you start thinking about these conversation starters and thinking about how those will play out once they take effect. So Ben, can you talk to us about the filing requirements? How will this play out?
Sure. So firms are going to be filing the relationship summaries with the commission. They're going to be filing through WebCRD and IRD. They'll be accessible on the commission's public website, investor.gov, in addition to obviously the firm's website to the extent they have one. Currently, registered IAs and BDs will have to file the form starting May 1st, when we anticipate the CRD and IRD systems being available to accept the filings. And that'll be up and through June 30th of 2020. After June 30th, all new registering IAs and BDs will be filing their CRS as part of the registration with the commission.
And so for those folks that are super excited about Form CRS, can they file before May 1?
Particularly so they can sync up with their
Right, yeah.
annual update to the Form ADV mailing at the end of April.
We anticipate the systems to be available starting May 1st.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the implementation issues, unfortunately, investment advisors are getting caught with, which is, everybody's doing their annual mailing out to clients at the end of April, at least if you have a December 31st fiscal year. And so you're just missing the cutoff to be able to send Form CRS along with a summary of material changes. And I think we've asked numerous times whether or not you can send it out early, send out your Form CRS early, based on the condition that what you mail out will be exactly identical to what ultimately gets filed with the SEC once the system's available on May 1st. And that hasn't been one of the questions that's been answered through the FAQ process. So I guess you can draw your own conclusions from that. On the one hand, it doesn't seem particularly risky, so long as what you send out is identical. On the other hand, you're technically not in compliance with the time requirements associated with the initial delivery. The SEC did provide a little bit of flexibility in terms of mailing the information out with your June 30th statement. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but I think firms do have the option to send the Form CRS out with their June 30th statement or quarterly performance report, which would effectively be sent out typically in early July. I think the issue there is that you just have to make sure between June 30th and whenever that quarterly mailing goes out, if there are new clients who come in, that they're getting the Form CRS at the time or before they actually open their advisory account.
So we have a little less than 10.
Just really quickly, the one other consideration you may want to keep in mind about delivering the Form CRS with your account statements is to make sure that it appears, if they're paper first. So I've heard from quite a few firms that they're struggling with that because in their paper mailing, they don't have a way to make sure that the Form CRS appears on the top before the account statement. Because the account statement, of course, has the box for the name and address that you put in the envelope. So just to keep that in mind, make sure that you're complying with the prominence requirements.
Yeah, and so we have about 5 minutes, a little over 5 minutes. I want to make sure we cover a couple of topics. So, yes, if paper on top, if you have a website, you have to post it on your website. Would like to talk about that if we have time at the end, but some issues around that. And the timing of it, Jen, is matches up with your brochure, right, before or at the time?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's helpful. I do want to talk about the redelivery requirement. Jen, can you maybe talk, so with respect to your initial clients, or your new clients, you have to do it, right?
Right.
Your existing clients, it's as this chart says, you will have to give it out to your existing clients within 30 days. After that, what are the triggers that require you to redeliver Form CRS, and what are some of the issues around that?
Yeah, so unlike the Part 2A of the Form ADV, it's not an annual mailing requirement. Rather, Form CRS is upfront, as Sanjay just said, and then there are triggers that require redelivery. The triggers are anytime you open a new account, recommend a rollover of assets from a retirement plan, or recommend or provide a new advisory service. That doesn't necessarily necessitate opening a new account. And I think this is one of the other issues where there has been a little bit of concern just around how to define these triggers, how they apply in certain circumstances. You know, if you open a new account but it's not a different type of service, does that require redelivery? Those sorts of issues. And so there are a couple things. I mean, I think firms are thinking about the redelivery obligations. I think some firms are thinking about periodically delivering the Form CRS, just to ensure that the clients have the latest and greatest and that they can address some of these requirements as well. But again, the delivery obligation is triggered by particular events.
Do you have any? Okay,
No.
great. I do want to talk about the website posting. Yeah, so the requirement is if you have it, you post it, it has to be prominent on the website. What
Right.
are the issues that you're sort of thinking about on that?
Right, so the requirement is that you provide it in a prominently in location and format that is easily accessible to retail investors. So what we're thinking of right now, as like most firms, we have a corporate homepage, and from that corporate homepage, you can select into a sub-website that's dedicated to the type of investing in which you're interested, right? So we have an institutional investors website, we have a personal investing website, which is dedicated to retail investors. So right now, we're exploring ways to provide links to the Form CRS from various places, from the most logical places within our site. So we're thinking of adding a link from our corporate site. So in case people get to us, you know, from www.tiroprice.com, and then also, of course, in our website that's dedicated to retail investors, we're going to be including prominent links on the homepage of that site, as well as on the key trigger pages. So where we talk about our advisory services, we'll also have a link to a landing page that includes our Form CRS and the conversation starters. So I think firms really need to think about not just having one link on their website, but making sure that it's easily accessible given the places within your site that retail investors are going to be going to look for the type of advisory services, right? So that goes back to the SEC's mandate of providing early and often. We want to make sure people have access to it before the enrollment process and they're signing up for the service.
So the updating requirements, Danielle, you just want to quickly mention
Yes.
sort of.
Yeah, so they're very similar to the requirements for updating the 2A brochure, with a notable exception. So there is a requirement to file an amended Form CRS within 30 days of the information becoming materially inaccurate. So right now, of course, the rule for the Part 2A is promptly. So promptly has been defined for purposes of Form CRS. But in other material respects, the updating requirements are very similar. You can file it as a part of your annual amendment or an other than annual amendment. And then you do have to either include a summary of material changes or include an exhibit marking the revised text. I will say one point on that last point is you have to be careful how you present your initial version of Form CRS to the public, because unless you want to highlight something that you may or may not have gotten 100% correct the first go-around, which is what you're going to have to do on your next version, you just want to make sure that you've adequately addressed to the best of your ability.
I think the other thing to think about is the materiality threshold for something changing on your Form CRS relates to the Form CRS itself, not to the underlying documentation that you might be linking to. So if your 2A is updated, or if there's a relationship brochure or other information that you may be linking to, so long as what's on the Form CRS continues to be accurate, you don't need to, for example, update your Form CRS and redeliver it because you've made changes to your 2A.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
So Ben, I want to end on a real positive note here. So the OC's exam priorities indicated that they will be looking at CRS compliance. Can you tell us a little bit about what examiners will be looking for and how your group will coordinate with
I thought this was
OC?
supposed to be a high note.
So obviously, this whole rulemaking package was a big SEC team effort. Like with others, we are in regular communication with our other offices and division, relevant touch points on it, and I will let my OC colleagues talk more directly about your question.
Right. We'll have Pete with us, Pete Driscoll, who's the OC director, so we'll see. Gil will make sure to ask that. So, well, so I want to end. I know we're out of time, but any sort of last, takeaways or key advice you want to give to folks in the audience as they think about their Form CRS implementation? Danielle.
Just one thought, and this won't help you in your initial filing, but I'm really interested to see how other firms, what other firms disclose in their Form CRS. If this is one of those voyeur opportunities, since they have to post them to their public website. I think we're really looking to see how other firms are addressing a lot of these issues, and frankly, we may revise our disclosures based on what we see others doing, if there's good language that others are using, or a particularly helpful design or presentation. So I encourage people to, go out and look at your competitors and see how they've
We've seen
complied.
disclosures that are very similar across very different.
Right.
Right, that's
Jen
typically
and-
what happens
Yeah.
with new disclosure. After the implementation, then there's this movement to the center in terms of disclosures.
Just remember the instruction about the boilerplate.
Jen, any sort of last?
Yeah, just really quickly, I would say if you have anxiety about Form CRS and how to actually do it, the easiest way is just to start doing it. Really put pen to paper and just start writing your Form CRS, because I think as you go through that process, you'll find maybe it's not as difficult as it seems, but it'll bring all of these issues to the forefront, and you can start working through all of them. I guess the other thing I would say is on the OC remark, it's not common to see the OC priorities talk about a rule that hasn't even yet been implemented. We haven't even hit the compliance date, and I think the SEC is under some pressure to ensure that it is examining against the Reg BI rule package broadly, which obviously includes Form CRS. So we expect that not only will the examiners be asking about implementation and compliance in advance of the compliance date, they will be, audit firms right after the compliance date looking at these issues. And so there's not as much of a grace period as there might ordinarily be for new rules in terms of allowing firms to get it right. Another reason to sort of start now and get it in place before the June 30th implementation date.
So Ben, I'll give you the last word. Any advice or warnings or?
Well, I'll start with a thanks. One, thank you for having me on the panel, and two, thank you to all of you who have contributed your comments and feedback. And I would encourage you all to continue that. The inbox is iabdquestions with an S at sec.gov. And if you're wondering who looks at these inboxes, you can at least visualize this face, reading most, if not all of them. But again, thank you, and please keep the feedback and comments and everything coming. So.
Right. I know we went a couple of minutes over. We have a lot of questions up here. I'm willing to stay here, and
Sure.
if anyone wants to come up, please ask us questions. We'll stick around. Please join me in thanking our excellent speakers, Danielle.